Amidst sun-gilded seashore, salt-washed breeze, and the occasional cacophony of seagulls, a weathered old man drags an equally old and worn dory up and onto a lonely rock in the middle of the cove. He's been looking forward to this moment all day, a chance to get away from everyone and everything, to lose himself in the soothing breath of the tide, as well as his stories. These are stories from the rock. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second season of Stories from the Rock. We have sound effects now. This season is going to be an awesome one, and I, for one, cannot wait to delve into things. It's been a rocky start, to say the least, but that's kind of our whole jam here at Stories from the Rock. We do things as we can, when we can, and follow a somewhat neurodiverse schedule, if you will. That said, we are starting off with a bang, so to speak. We have two stories for this episode, and this season itself looks already to be a pretty big one. The first story for this episode is actually dedicated to our late editor, Trish. Trish was an immense storyteller. She had this way of words that, even in casual conversation, was poetic and poignant at times, eloquent at others. She rarely spoke up, but when she did, it was always the perfect thing that one could expect someone to say in that moment. And of course, she poured that into her writing as well. Very early this year, Trish Stone lost her battle against depression and discrimination. She was an openly trans person, and her family from the southern United States, well, they didn't have, you could say, they weren't as open and welcoming to her unique way of life as she would have hoped. Trish's favorite day of the entire year was Friday the 13th. She considered it a lucky day rather than an unlucky day. She celebrated it as a second Halloween, no matter how it fell in any part of the year. That was her second Halloween for that year, and she was absolutely floored and looking forward to Friday the 13th coming up in June, because she also was a huge fan of summer. Unlike me, I'm not a summery person. Sure, everything's beautiful, but my neurodivergent traits make stabbing sunlight and high-resolution detail one that slowly wears me down. I also really hate heat. Trish was an autistic person who loved those things. She was a sensory seeker. She basked in sunlight and heat for fun, which still boggles my mind. But that's the thing about neurodiversity. Even when we share the same neurotype, often traits go in wildly different directions. And that's something that Trish always celebrated as well. The diversity of life and the wild directions that everybody takes on their path, regardless of who they are. She was in France at the time of her death. She had just found new love and was so head over heels when she had gotten some unfortunate news from her family back home that, well, it was too much for her to bear. I covered some of that in our first story, dedicated to Trish Stone. And while it's a work of fiction, it touches on some very important truth. And I hope that some people listening might end up changing their minds about a few things as well. Let's jump right in to our first story, Trish's Wishes. Trish's Wishes by T.C. Bursey, and dedicated to the memory of Patricia Stone. Trish's hands shook as she read the letter again. Her eyes stung. Her breath came in miniature screams, as if her throat were being murdered by 100 daggers, and she fell to each one, slashing, tearing, stabbing, betraying. Tears bloomed upon her mother's floral stationery like fireworks. Patrick, the letter began. Though my heart aches to write this, my patience has been exhausted. My reputation in our community has been torn to shreds. I now know that you won't have mercy on your family and that your love has always been a lie after another lie. I taught you, Patrick, that actions speak louder than words, so I'll speak your language of hurt on top of our mutual language of American English. Don't come home. This isn't your home anymore. I suppose, in a way, you've been dead for a long time. Perhaps that's where dead name comes from. And it's time I move on with my grief. Attached is a photo of the headstone we made for our backyard, right under the oak tree where you played as a little boy. Trish Stone exploded into hard sobs. She covered her eyes with one hand and her perforated heart with another, as she cried with more hurt than she had ever thought possible. She had known it was coming, felt it somewhere deep in the bone marrow of her being, but knowing didn't soften the blow. It only ensured that the knife was sharp, steady, and aimed true. Trish rocked forward on the old thrift store couch, her body folding over itself as though she could protect some last tender part of her from the letter's damage, but no part had been spared. Her mother's words were surgical, final, cold as the stone etched with her dead name. She picked up the photograph, hands trembling. The headstone was tasteful. Polished granite engraved with Patrick Allen Stone, beloved son. Underneath, a single date, her birth date. No death. Not even the courage to invent one, she whispered through clenched teeth. She tore the photo in half, then quarters, then confetti. She wanted to scream, to break glass, to undo the bloodline that had tied her to such cruelty. But instead, she stood, moved to the mirror. Her makeup was ruined. Black rivers ran down her cheeks. She wiped at them uselessly, then threw the towel aside. I'm still here, she whispered to her reflection, her voice cracked. I'm still me. The lights flickered. Trish paused. The apartment was old and moody, but that felt different. She turned back toward the letter, now crumpled at her feet like a wounded animal. Then the air shifted. The sound came first, an unnatural silence, like a vacuum of sound rather than a lack of it. Then a shimmer, just to her left, like heat waves on a hot road, but inside. And then a voice, soft, feminine, familiar but foreign. Trish Stone, your wishes have been heard. Trish froze. What? Out of the glimmer stepped a figure in a dark silver cloak, face partially hidden beneath a hood, but glowing faintly at the edges, like starlight diffused through fog. I am the custodian of wishes unspoken, the figure said. You've cried out not just in grief, but in truth. And truth, my dear, is the currency of real magic. Trish blinked. The surreal grief buzz in her skull made her question reality, but somehow the moment felt more real than the last hour had. The figure continued. 3 wishes, no tricks, no riddles, just your heart shaped into words. Trish laughed bitterly, chest heaving. Wishes? Like a fairy godmother. You picked the wrong girl. I am not Cinderella. I'm the pumpkin.
You have already made one wish, Trish, when you cried, I want to be seen. Trish's mouth went dry. The figure gestured toward the cracked mirror. Slowly, Trish turned. Her reflection stared back at her, not broken or weeping or small, but tall, solid, radiant. Her shoulders were square, her eyes resolute. Her makeup had returned, pristine. Her hair shimmered with a soft light that seemed to come from inside her. Your first wish is granted, said the figure. You will be seen for who you are. Trish turned back around, dazed. And the second? That is yours to shape, the custodian said. But understand this. Wishes don't change the world for you. They change the world with you. Trish thought, her breath finally slowing. Her hands no longer shook. Somewhere under the grief and fury, a pulse of something familiar stirred. Power. She straightened her spine. I want a place to call home, she said. A real home. One that can't be taken away from me. The figure nodded once. Wish too. It will come, but you must build its door. Trish opened her mouth to ask what that meant, but before she could, the shimmering began to recede. The custodian's form grew less distant, dissolving like steam. One wish remains, the voice echoed, already distant. Save it wisely. And then the silence was just silence. The apartment lights returned to normal. The air settled. Trish stood there for a long time, then picked up the letter again. But this time, it felt like just paper, a relic of someone else's grief. She didn't burn it, didn't tear it further. Instead, she folded it carefully and slid it into a drawer she rarely used. It was time to write something new. The next morning, the world looked different, though nothing had changed. The street outside her apartment still moaned with rusted buses and grunted pickup trucks. Her upstairs neighbor still stomped around like a tap-dancing buffalo, but inside her chest, something fundamental had rearranged itself. She made coffee without crying. That was new. Trish sat at the chipped wooden table, steam curling up from her mug, and opened her laptop, not to scroll endlessly or escape into streaming shows like usual. No, she opened a blank document. Project Home, she typed into the top. Her fingers hovered. Build the door, the custodian had said. A home couldn't simply be conjured. It had to be claimed, brick by brick, friend by friend, word by word. So Trish did what she did best. She wrote. 3 weeks later. Trish adjusted the mic on the small wooden podium. The old library room smelled of mothballs and secondhand dreams. But it was hers. Well, hers for the hour, thanks to the librarian, who'd quietly offered the space after reading Trish's flyer. Trans Peer Support Group. Weekly. Safe. Confidential. Welcoming. Come as you are. Leave with more than you came with. There were 5 others in the room. Some looked even more nervous than she felt. A teenager with a shaved head and sleeves too long for their arms. An older woman with a cane and eyes full of stories. A non-binary person in overalls who stared too long at the floor. Every one of them held tension like armor. Trish smiled softly. My name's Trish, she began, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. And I wanted to create a space that no one could take from any of us. She looked around. I don't know What this group will become, I don't know. What I wish for it to become: honest, soft, angry when it needs to be, and safe when the world isn't. So, welcome home, if you want it. A silence followed, but not the brittle kind. It was the kind that held possibility. That night, Trish sat in bed, wrapped in her favorite oversized hoodie, exhaustion draped around her like a weighted blanket. Her phone buzzed. A message from Devon, the teen with the sleeves. "Thank you. Tonight was the first time I didn't feel like I had to shrink." Trish didn't cry. Not exactly, but something warm welled up inside her. Soft and golden and almost too big for her ribs. She whispered to the ceiling, "I built the door, didn't I?" The air shimmered, just slightly. The custodian did not appear this time, but her voice did, echoing faint and kind. "Yes, Trish, you did." 2 months later. The group had grown. 12 people now. A newsletter. Even a donated mini fridge stocked with juice and snacks. Trish had met people who made her laugh until her ribs ached, and others who've helped her patch together what parts of her that her family's rejection had torn apart. The pain still lived in her. It probably always would, but it wasn't alone anymore. It had company now. Strength, joy, fire. And sometimes, when the moonlight hits just right, Trish would glance at that drawer with the letter inside and feel not anger, not sadness, pity. Her family had buried a name and lost a child. But Trish, she'd gained a self. One final wish. It was the day of the city's Pride Festival. Trish stood backstage at the community stage, about to give a speech. She wore a long, flowing dress the color of twilight, her hair swept back in a braid laced with ribbons. She looked like a queen, and she felt like one too. She stepped forward to thunderous applause. As the crowd quieted, she looked out at the sea of faces, new friends, old wounds, chosen family. She took a breath. "My name is Trish Stone," she said clearly, "and I was once told I was dead." A hush fell. Some knew, some didn't, but all leaned closer. "Well, I'm not," she said. "I'm more alive than I've ever been. I'm living proof that when people try to bury you, if you're lucky, you become a seed." The cheers began again, loud and echoing. Later, under a tree at the edge of the park, Trish sat quietly, letting the noise fade into birdsong and breeze. And for the first time since that awful letter, she said it out loud. "I know my third wish." The air stilled. Soft light danced in the dappled leaves above. "I wish somebody they find healing. I don't want them to hurt like they made me hurt. Not forever. Let them grow too. Let them change." There was no shimmering this time, no voice, but a breeze passed through, warm and clean, and Trish could have sworn the tree bent gently toward her in a bow. And that is the story that I wanted to put out on the 13th of Friday the 13th of this year. Just a couple weeks ago, or perhaps a week ago now, I'm not too sure. I'm trying not to cry. um, that was for Trish, our editor, who tragically passed away, as mentioned. and she passed away as a result of much of what I had just spoken about in this story, much of what I had just recited. Um, I wrote it over and over again. It was usually it's a first draft only for me thing, and but I wanted to make sure this one was good, and it's for Trish. Sorry, Friday the 13th. I had a bit of bad luck, and the laptop got smashed, and my schedule got completely rearranged. So this episode's a little late, but yeah, it's for Trish, and I wanted to make sure it was done right for her. But with that aside, Trish, it was very much a person who enjoyed moving on from things. She didn't dwell on things very often, or at least she made that tough front to hide perhaps that things affected her a little bit more deeply than she let on. So we're gonna move on to in as many ways as we can, and in a literal sense, to the next story. This one is titled "The Unraveling of Archibald Snow," and it's a short story that I'd actually dug up out of some old papers that I had thrown in what I like to call my ADHD drawer. For those of you who don't know, I'm neurodivergent, but I'm diagnosed as an autistic, and I highly suspect it's ADHD because I have many traits, wonderful little quirks that are also associated with ADHD. I used to enjoy a lot of scavenger hunts and stuff along those lines, pleasant surprises, which is typically a little bit outside of my neurotype scale if I was completely 100% just autistic. I love surprises and changes in routine to a degree. I love my routine and it keeps me sane and it keeps me somewhat competent, but at the same time, I need to shake up my routine or else I go a little bit stir crazy. And that was part of what actually inspired uh, this story, The Unraveling of Archibald Snow. And I'll recite it for you now. The Unraveling of Archibald Snow, a short story by me, T.C. Bursey. Archibald Snow let out a quiet sigh, setting down his tea with a clink on his saucer. Honestly, Clementine, he said to the calico perched on the windowsill, who turned her head and blinked at him with mild disdain. The ball of yarn rolled across the hardwood floor in lazy spirals, bouncing off the leg of the coffee table and spinning beneath the old radiator. It was a deep burgundy yarn, Margaret's favorite shade. She had been knitting something before the cancer took her hand's strength. A sweater, perhaps, or one of her ridiculous tea cozies. He hadn't touched the yarn in a year. The chair still bore the imprint of her. Stooping with a creak in his knees, Archibald reached under the radiator and retrieved the ball of yarn. It had unraveled slightly from the fall, exposing something hard nestled in its core. He blinked. Tucked within the soft tangle was a small silver rectangle, cool, smooth, and unreasonably heavy for its size. He teased it free, holding it up to the light. It shimmered faintly, engraved with looping letters he hadn't seen in decades. UNRAVEL. Unravel. That was all it said. One word, but it was enough. In the silence of his study, surrounded by dust jackets of long dead authors, Archibald set the codex down beneath his brass reading lamp. The surface glinted, runic at first glance, but clearer the longer he stared. Letters emerged like oil on water, curling and playful. He rotated the codex. There, a groove, a sliding panel. He eased it open. Inside, etched with the precision of a jeweler's hand, were coordinates. Below them, just a single line in that familiar hand he knew so well. First drink, last dance, love M. He tapped the coordinates into his computer, fingers trembling with something dangerously close to hope. Toll's Timeout Lounge. The bar from the 20s, back when Archibald had more hair and fewer anxieties, when Margaret had worn bell bottoms and no shoes, when they used to dance for hours under dollar store disco balls and drink whiskey sours until last call. He hadn't thought about Tolls in years. He leaned back, stared at the codex again, and said aloud to no one in particular, "Well, damn me, Mar. What have you gotten me into?" Clementine meowed and sneezed in reply. Scene break. The cabbie dropped him outside the squat stone building nestled in St. John's, sandwiched between a pawn shop and a shuttered bakery. A blinking red light still read "Tolls," though most of the letters were out. Inside, the place smelled of beer, floor cleaner, and a faint echo of sea salt. "Archibald?" the bartender said before he'd even fully stepped inside. He was a stout man, with a ginger beard and warm eyes. "You look already like your photo. Margaret gave it to me. Said I'd know when to use it." Archibald's heart kicked into his ribs. "You knew Margaret?" "Knew of her. She mailed me a letter years back. Told me one day you'd come, and to give you this when you did." He reached under the counter and slid out a laminated placemat, the kind you give to kids, all bright colors and sticky crayon scrawls. It was from Peter Easton's, a seafood restaurant a few blocks down. Drawn over the top, in looping red crayon, was a map. Scene break. Peter Easton's was quieter than he remembered. Gone were the crowds and raucous music. Instead, soft folk music trickled from the speakers. The hostess barely looked at Archibald as he wandered in. He studied the map. It was childish, but accurate in a way Mar always was. Each X marked with a playful flourish. The final one landed near the fireplace in the back dining room. There, behind a loose stone in the wall, he found it. Another codex, smaller this time, silver, warm to the touch. He turned it over in his hands, heart hammering in his chest. The moment he opened it, a small letter unfolded from within, like a paper flower. "Dearest Archie, if you're reading this, then you've found my thread, like Theseus out of the labyrinth. Do you remember how we used to play scavenger hunts throughout the city, leaving notes in mailboxes and payphones and library books? You once said every clue felt like falling in love with me again. I want you to fall again. I know grief has wrapped you in gray, but I want you to remember in color. I want you to chase the silly, the sacred, the secret things we shared. This hunt is one last game, one last dance in a city that was always ours. You'll find your next clue where we got snowed in on your 37th birthday. Always yours, M." Archibald wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. The memory came running in like a tide. How they'd been trapped through a blizzard in that little bookstore downtown, reading poetry by flashlight, drinking contraband rum out of a thermos. Scene break. The bookstore, Harrington's, was still there, narrower than he remembered, though maybe that was just time compressing things. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. A young woman behind the till looked up and smiled. "Mr. Snow?" Archibald blinked. "Yes?" "Your wife said you'd be by eventually." She reached under the desk and pulled out a copy of Yeats's selected poems, well worn and familiar. A bookmark protruded halfway through. Inside was a note. Clue number 3. Where the waves kissed our shoes and you proposed with a pretzel ring. Middle Cove, Archibald whispered, a laugh catching in his throat. The memory was absurd and perfect. They'd been poor and cold. They'd had nothing but a salted pretzel and nerves. She'd cried and said yes anyway. He drove himself this time, the salty wind hitting his face like a baptism. At the far end of the beach, in a small wooden box tucked beneath a driftwood log, he found it, the final codex. This one was gold tinged. Inside, instead of a riddle or coordinates, was a photo. It was of them, young, tanned, laughing, covered in sand. On the back, written in her loopy, sun-warmed handwriting, "This is how I see us still." Underneath was a folded note. "Archie, you've made it. I knew you would. You've always been too curious not to finish a mystery. Here's the truth, love. I was afraid you'd close yourself off, that you'd grow quiet and old and gray before your time, that the grief would take root in you and grow thorns. But you were always the man who looked at the stars instead of the void. These places weren't just memories, they were proof that we lived, that we loved, that we laughed until our faces hurt and got drunk in places we shouldn't have, and danced like teenagers until we didn't care if people stared. I wanted you to remember those parts, because they're still you. If you've come this far, maybe it's time for one last thing, one last gift. Go back to the lighthouse, my love. You'll understand when you get there. All my adoration, Margaret." Scene break. He hadn't visited the lighthouse since her memorial. It had always been their place, his proposal spot, their rainy picnic hideaway, the right of more than one whiskey-fueled argument, and several passionate makeups. Archibald drove there in silence. The sky blushed lavender, the sea was still. The door creaked open. Inside, the sparse was just as he remembered. The air smelled of sea and salt and lavender oil. On the table beneath the spiral stairs was a final package, wrapped in paper and string. With shaking hands, he opened it. Inside was a journal. Her handwriting filled its pages. Notes, thoughts, recipes, memories, love letters, apologies, doodles, everything they'd ever been and more. He flipped to the last page. A photograph was tucked there, a recent one. Him sitting in his armchair, Clementine in his lap, both unaware. A note was scrawled underneath. "See, I'm still here, my darling. I never left. Now go live a little longer, for both of us." The lighthouse lamp, dormant for decades, flickered on just as the sun set. Archibald looked up, startled, as light swept out across the sea. He didn't know how it had lit. Maybe someone had fixed the wiring. Maybe the sea was feeding generous. Or maybe it was Margaret. He sat in the chair at the top of the spiral, journal in hand, and began to read. The light revolved. The wind whispered. And the past wrapped around him, not like a shroud, but like a blanket. Warm, safe, and alive. And that concludes our second story for the first episode of this season. I think I wrote that sometime in 2023, but I'm not quite sure when. It was just one of those stories that gripped me. I basically had to write it down for fear of losing it. I really liked the theme, the codexes, the scavenger hunt, and originally I had it planned to be more modern day with some people like myself, but I decide much of the outcome of my stories with like a 20-sided die or a flip of a coin. Sometimes that ends up being inspirational. The ideas that come from that randomness kind of make it a better story, and that's how this happened. I rolled for ages and got an elderly couple, and yeah, it was a great story. I remembered, and I knew I had tucked it away in that drawer for a reason. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, everybody, and take care. There's lots more to come in the second season of Stories from the Rock. Join us next time for more stories from the Rock.